Hi BookTube, and welcome to another non-fiction review. How has the book that we will review today been described? Well, in one review, it was called a red-hot grenade, and in another, a wake-up call. Abdelrahman ElGendy, writing in the Michigan Quarterly Review, suggested that the book's title was chosen because it rolled off the tongue more smoothly than if it were called How to Dismantle Your Entire Critical Apparatus. But that is essentially what this book is trying to achieve. Today we are reviewing How to Read Now, which is essays by Elaine Castillo, published in the year 2022, 340 pages, of which 314 are the text. I won't comment much on the Kindle prices. I didn't really look for any secondhand copies online. I really just got on, bought and read this book immediately. Nick at Dr. Cranky Pants Reads, I believe, mentioned this book late November, early December, and I went out and bought it immediately. I don't know what it was. He was so clearly passionate about what it had to say and how it could help readers that I just thought, oh, I've taken his recommendations before. I have never been sorry. Nick also recommended to me once that I should read The Order of Things by Michel Foucault, which I haven't done yet, but I strongly suspect Elaine Castillo has, along with some other writings which question assumptions about thinking and reading. This is a book to test your analytical sharpness, and if, like me, you find some dullness, then you use this book to get a better cutting edge. This is going to be a longer review than normal because I want to do justice to the material. I agree with Nick that this is a very important book to read. Let's meet the author. Elaine Castillo was born in 1984 in the San Francisco Bay Area. She went to the University of California at Berkeley and then on to Goldsmiths, University of London, where she took her MA in creative and life writing. In 2018, she published her first book of nonfiction, America is Not the Heart. And that title is an allusion to the novel by Carlos Bulosan, published in 1943 and called America is in the Heart. Castillo was also commissioned to write the foreword for the 2019 Penguin Classics edition of Bulosan's novel. Now, her current work, 2025, came out a novel called Moderation. Now, I purchased a Kindle copy of that novel. The marketing write-up is comparing it with Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. I've not read Zevin's book, so I can't comment on that. If you're interested in a summary of Moderation, there is a link in my description box to a YouTube video where Castillo talks about that book. And also, of course, there'll be a link to her website. And now let's talk quickly about the structure. You have got in your 314 pages, 10 pages which are the author's note, and then you've got 8 essays which average about 38 pages each. I read it on Kindle, so again, I can't really give you a sense of what the book would look like as a paperback on the page. But what I want to stress is that this is a grown-up read. I really had to take my time. I had to reread and reread some passages. I had to use Google frequently to get definitions of words or to decode acronyms because I had a different translation of a particular one. Or I needed cultural context because Elaine loves film and television, and her 7th essay in particular talks about Chinese films and actors. Of course, I needed some help with those. And I had to revisit all the essays again in order to write this review. Now, Kathy Chow was writing her review of How to Read Now in the Los Angeles Times. And for her, she recognized echoes from earlier authors in Castillo's work. And she said she wasn't hearing anything that was new for her. However, for me, and I suspect for a lot of white readers, there was nothing in our education to furnish us with a critical approach to our own culture, but rather the opposite. There isn't a great deal of other references in this book. There's a short list of works cited, and then a few notes which are included as commentary along with those titles cited. Let me share with you what Castillo herself says about her book. She says, "But I am a bossy Virgo bitch. And I have generally always been irritatingly sure of myself and my convictions, occasionally to my detriment, certainly to the chagrin of those who have chosen to love me. But I would be lying if I said that the events of 2020 and 2021 hadn't profoundly affected me and begun to permanently transform how I think about the world and how to make art in it. I think most of all, it's become clear to me that when I named the book How to Read Now, I must have subconsciously meant the title both as a bossy Virgo directive and as an inquiry, a question, open-ended. I, too, want to know how to read now. What I want to do now is give you a summary and some comments on each of the essays in the book. We start with the author's note, or as she titles it, a Virgo clarifies things, and if anybody can clarify things, it is a Virgo. She wants to ask the question, what does she mean by reading? And also, who is her intended audience? And she states it right out. Her intended audience, she's speaking to America because she lives in America. Although I think, just commenting personally, the issues she addresses exist equally in Canada, in the UK, and in Western Europe. Castillo also has a very broad definition of reading. She's going to talk about books, but not only books. Any form of art that it is necessary to read. So, for example, film and television. These art forms are also going to be extensively examined because they have symbols which need interpretation, and that is the reading. Now, Elaine Castillo admits, as I mentioned in her quote, that it was the events of 2020 and 2021, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the growth and rise of the power of MAGA, that changed permanently her way of looking at how art is produced. She concludes the author's notes by saying that yes, the title sounds just as bossy as her Virgo personality, but the book was really written for herself as a means of questioning herself as well as urging her readers to ask the same questions. And then the second essay is the title essay, How to Read Now. And Castillo is asking what is wrong with the way books are edited, published, promoted, and read right now. And she brings her Virgo, bossy girl persona into this chapter. And if I were giving this book to anyone, white, American, or European, I would tell them, put a tight leash on your natural defensiveness, right? Or better still, that instinct that you have to argue back, put that in a soundproof room and lock the door for a while. I think we're all primed to defend ourselves against criticism, but just because a reaction is automatic or happens quickly doesn't mean it's the most useful one or the wisest one. I'm reminded of a team building workshop that I attended. This was some years back. One of those things that your employer sends you on to help you all get together and work together as a team better. And the trainer asked all of us this question. She said, I want you to put your hands up depending upon which of these things is more important to you. Is it more important to you to be right, or is it more important for you to solve the problem at hand? And I was shocked by how many people put up their hands and said it was more important for them to be right. Because the thought then occurred to me, how the heck can we move forward with any social issue if we have all these people who can't stand to admit that they're wrong? And that's applicable, I think, to the reading of this book. The most important lesson that I took from this essay is the value of sometimes owning our own smallness. That is, lowering our defenses, not trying to defend ourselves against our real vulnerability. I don't know that I'd ever considered that before as important for reading. It argues maybe against coming to every book as a consumer, expecting some kind of product on the page, or else we're dissatisfied and we're giving up. At least some of the time, it might be good to ask if those expectation levels that we have are really a form of defense to protect us from feeling less powerful in the presence of certain books and what they have to say. Essay number 3 is titled Reading Teaches Us Empathy and Other Fictions. It calls into question that beloved view, and it was a view that up until I read this essay, I held dear, that books are sort of automatic empathy machines. You open them, you read them, voila, a change happens in you. And I'm quoting Castillo here from the first page of the essay. She says, but the idea that fiction builds empathy is one of incomplete politics. She questions the whole critical argument that art can be enjoyed just for its own sake, and that just the reading of books that will just take care of everything. And to illustrate how dangerous that attitude can be, she devotes the rest of the essay to a detailed analysis of the novel by the Austrian author Peter Handke, which was published in 1983. The English translated title is Across, which bears no resemblance to the German original. And when Elaine explained the German title, I felt cheated of information, important information. And I agree with Castillo that Handke's novel is not apolitical, as some of his admirers have claimed. Of course, I should have asked myself, did I really believe that the mechanics of reading and empathy were so simple? That you just open books, read them, and you gain empathy automatically. It's true that some of the least empathetic people I know are non-readers, yes. But it's also true that here on BookTube I've watched some very unempathetic episodes from people who clearly read more books than I do. So reading of itself is not sufficient. It is not an automatic empathy-creating formula. But I'm not doing justice to this essay. I feel that even as I'm saying it. I really feel that this particular chapter of Castillo's book should be some kind of compulsory reading. I don't know for who, but I feel it would give everyone better tools for analyzing the books that they read. The fourth essay is called Honor the Treaty, and here is where Castillo starts to move away from books as such, but still to other things that we read. In this case, it's national origin stories and also those agreements that we make legally. So what are our national origin stories doing to us? Are they causing us to read ourselves incorrectly? And I think that's a really important point. Castillo looks at how different colonized countries have managed their origin stories and the degree to which they've been willing to actually incorporate historic facts into those stories or not, and incorporate more truth into those narratives than they previously had. It's going to be a painful read, but a really, really good one. Chapter 5, the essay is titled The Limits of White Fantasy, and Castillo asks whether a constant story diet that is full of white protagonists battling oppression and exclusion, does that undermine our empathy for real-life marginalized groups? And what she does is she compares fantasy works like Harry Potter and the X-Men series against DC's Watchmen, and she's just discussing how effectively fantasy genre fiction creates empathy for marginalized groups. She suggests that a lot of fantasy plays out stories of struggles against oppression, which centers white characters, even though the real life situations are more often than not going to be lived out by non-white characters. And I could probably do with revisiting this chapter, just a note, because I haven't watched many of the films or read many of the graphic novels that she referred to. And if you're the same as me, if you've only seen the odd X-Men movie, a couple of Harry Potters or something, and read no graphic novels, then Elaine's recap of what happens in those stories might be your first time. And I think I would have gained more understanding had I already known those films and graphic novels better. Essay number 6 is titled Main Character Syndrome. And Castillo talks about how it's possible to tell many different stories without actually telling the story of many different people. And that's difficult to explain. Castillo focuses for this essay on Joan Didion's essays, along with some other American writers, to illustrate how pervasive and therefore how little noticed is this tendency for writers on both print and screen to develop white heteronormative characters to center their experience. And characters with different profiles function, well, they're always on the sidelines, aren't they? They're providing comic relief or cannon fodder, or emotional support, timely assistance, but they aren't people in the same way that the white characters are people with fully developed stories. Castillo's able to draw on examples also that she's already pointed out in previous essays. Chapter 7 is titled Reality is All We Have to Love. And Castillo is harking back to the Me Too movement and suggesting that maybe we shouldn't have confidentiality clauses when we are discussing and analyzing literature. And she says this because she's critiquing her experience that she had in a postgraduate literature workshop at Goldsmiths University in London. And she notes that there have been similar criticisms leveled at the institution by writers of color who've attended in the past. She's emphasizing that there's an error in trying to evade any discussion of political or social issues when you are analyzing a literary work. That's one of the art for art's sake critical practices. And she opposes it because it creates silences about the realities that are being described. And those silences, that's a political act in itself. I think, in fact, that the motto, "Reality is all we have to love," could be an alternative title for this book. All Castillo's essays put forward is that we've got many ways in which we love illusions about the books that we have read and what they actually provide us. And she's pleading with us, could we please love the reality instead? Essay number 8 has a longer title. It's called Autobiography in Asian Film, or What We Talk About When We Talk About Representation. And here she wants to say that representation is not happening just because a non-white face appears on camera when we would have expected it previously to have been a white face. And in this essay, Castillo shares some personal pain, combined with observations about films that she's watched, not always loved, but watched, and talks more about this business of enforced silences and the intimate, familial ways that these silences protect the political status quo. Elaine talks about her favorite Chinese actor and the characters played as a way of illustrating the difference between a film that is historical without being what she calls capital H historical. That is, where the main character, let's say they meet a girl in the city where they work, but she is not an Asian girlfriend in that capital A, capital G, Asian girlfriend way. There isn't a note in the script to remind the casting director that they need to check their catalogue of Asian actors and pick the right face for the camera in a movie that is otherwise populated by white actors. Elaine is calling, I think, for something better than just non-white faces appearing in stories where a white face would previously have been the norm. She wants more than just a stage pass into white stories. She wants stories that belong to the non-white people who are playing them. And the final essay is called The Children of Polyphemus. And this is talking about what a difference a post-colonial critique of the Odyssey makes, or how would the story of the encounter with Cyclops have read if it had been written by other Cyclops. There is actually that and much more going on in this essay. I want to witness a shock that I got learning about the origin of Filipino surnames. The concept of the surname in the Philippines is a young one. It begins only around 1849 with the Claveria Decree, a Spanish colonial law issued by the Governor-General of the Philippines, requiring natives to adopt a name from the Catálogo Alfabético de Apellidos, or Alphabetic Catalogue of Surnames, for the Spanish Empire's legal and civil use. The catalogue included both Spanish and indigenous surnames, along with words from the animal, mineral, and vegetable kingdoms, geographical terms, and artistic terms, though the overwhelming majority of the words in the catalogue were indeed Spanish, and indigenous words were, of course, transcribed by Spanish speakers following Spanish phonetics and grammar. It was sent to different towns and settlements across the archipelago, with locals free to choose their own names. Here was freedom and bondage woven together, the illusory freedom of choosing one's own name, but only at the pleasure of the colonial state for the convenience of its administrative efficiency. The lack of distinctive native family names in the archipelago made the daily practices of empire difficult. After all, how could one reliably collect the maximum amount of tax revenue from these diffuse social groups, whose connection to each other could not be codified according to European civil structures? Did tribespeople who shared children but did not share a name even count as a family? Certainly not a good Christian one. How could one be sure a birth or marriage was legitimate, at least according to the only authority that mattered, shredded white Jesus? The only people exempt from choosing a name from the Catálogo were those who had either already adopted a name from the list at an earlier time, or could prove that their own surname had been in use for at least 4 generations, which would likely mostly comprise the archipelago's mestizo, Spanish and Chinese middle class. Children whose fathers were dead were assigned their grandfather's surname or their uncle's surname. Only children of unknown fathers were given their mother's surname. Some accounts have surnames being distributed according to town size, with A surnames given to provincial capitals and C surnames to smaller towns. The effect on Philippine historiography is mixed. One obvious negative result is that genealogical studies for families from the towns where the decree was enforced are hopelessly handicapped. Without the good fortune of stumbling on a document giving both old and new surnames, it is almost impossible to identify Filipino family trees beyond 1849. And what you may have noticed is the way I pronounce Elaine's surname. You might have been thinking, oh, she's not doing it right because it's Spanish, and so she should say Castillo, not Castillo. Well, I'm deliberately saying Castillo, and that's because Elaine's family took a decision to alter the pronunciation of their surname as an act of remembering that this colonial imposition that I just read about cut them off from their ancestors. And that is why I have pronunciation reminders all over this review. You can't see them. They're telling me to make sure I say Castillo, not Castillo. And I wonder, is this Castillo's acid test, which determines whether or not someone has read her book all the way through and read it carefully? If they mispronounce her surname, it may tell her something about how that person does their reading. My rabbit hole. I've got to be quick. I feel like I've taken up so much time already, but there's just so much to go into. The rabbit hole I want to talk about is what I'm definitely going to do differently now that I've finished reading How to Read Now. It adds a whole new angle on my critical evaluation of any fiction. I'm going to start asking, who is the expected audience for this book? And also, who is the unexpected audience? And how can I tell? And I can back it up then with quotes from the book. I suppose it means talking about representation with more thought, not just noting that diverse characters appear, but analyzing the roles they play and how carefully or not they are drawn. Are they sketched in by stereotype or backgrounded, while the white cis hetero characters are depicted in finer detail? Remember Joe Nesbo's remark that every book is political, whether or not it is trying to be. What might be inferred about the author's personal politics based on how they wrote their book? It is another critical stance that can be taken. And also, I think I should continue to refuse the lead of the book publishing and book retailing businesses in how I search out my books. I should start looking not for the books they forefront and put right in front of my face as a performative act, but maybe look for the books they keep in the background or ignore altogether. The ones that aren't promoted on their tables, or the ones that don't get awarded with decorative cover art. It might be good for me to keep an eye on smaller publishing houses who have completely different business aims, because they might be looking out titles that wouldn't catch the more mainstream. And maybe look for fiction that hasn't been reprinted or hasn't been conventionally published. All these things. And also continue to research my authors thoroughly, because at the end of the day, someone who has lived experience is probably going to tell a better story about that experience, even fictionally, than someone who has to learn from research. And that's another review done. It's a very busy description box. I used to end every review with some recommended reading, and I stopped doing that because it started to feel a bit artificial. I was forcing myself to recommend a book, even if one didn't come to mind. In this case, Elaine Castillo refers frequently to a work by Toni Morrison that I'd never heard mentioned on BookTube. I didn't know about myself. She said she gave a talk at a literary festival and was surprised when she mentioned this work by Toni Morrison that no one in the audience had read it, okay? It is Playing in the Dark, Whiteness and the American Literary Imagination. And I was one of those people, I'd never heard of this book. Knowing Toni Morrison's extensive experience in publishing, she worked as an editor in Random House for almost 20 years. This would give her insight into how does publishing curate our approach to reading, and how does it contribute to some of the critical blind spots that Castillo talks about in How to Read Now. I bought myself a paperback copy for my birthday, so you can look forward to another long review probably where I go through those essays. In the meantime, happy reading, everybody, and until I see you again in a few days' time, take care. Bye-bye.